The gates of the Wakefield estate loomed like silent sentinels, their black iron bars gleaming faintly under the morning sun. Beyond them stretched a sprawling mansion, its pale stone walls washed in muted gold by the early light. Richard Wakefield's empire had been built on deals, risks, and a vision that few could see. But no amount of wealth could shield him from the loneliness that pervaded these halls. Inside, silence reigned. The long corridors were lined with portraits of ancestors and landscapes framed in ornate gold. Each step echoed, betraying the emptiness of a house that had once thrived with laughter. And at the center of it all sat Ethan, the billionaire's son, in a high-backed chair near the window, holding a small, worn toy airplane in his hands. His face was still, pale, almost frozen in thought, and his eyes stared straight ahead. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Doctors had declared him blind from birth. Specialists, tutors, therapists, every professional Richard could afford, had confirmed it, and for years he accepted it as unchangeable truth. Ethan didn't respond to sounds, music, or voices. His tiny world was contained within the mansion's walls, silent and detached. Richard had poured everything he had into creating a life for his son, but nothing seemed to reach him. The staff of the mansion moved cautiously around him, speaking only when necessary, afraid to disturb the fragile balance of the household. Their whispers described Ethan as delicate, unreachable, even ghost-like. Richard, however, refused to give in. Every morning he would sit beside Ethan, carefully guiding his hands through toys, recounting stories of the city outside, or simply reading aloud in the hope that his voice might somehow spark recognition. It was a routine that had defined the last 7 years of Richard's life. And yet, beneath the surface of this rigid routine simmered a quiet desperation. That morning, a different sound broke the usual monotony, the crunch of footsteps approaching the front entrance. Richard had hired dozens of maids and housekeepers over the years, but today, there was a subtle difference in the way he watched the doorway. He could feel it instinctively. Some intuition, a hunch he didn't understand but couldn't ignore. Julia Bennett stepped lightly onto the marble floor, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She was not flashy. Her uniform was simple, her movements careful, deliberate. And yet the air around her carried a quiet confidence, an aura of someone who had survived pain and had learned to navigate it without creating noise. Richard, tall and lean, appeared at the top of the staircase to greet her. His face was etched with exhaustion, his eyes carrying both the weight of business empires and the ache of a father who had not yet broken through to his only son. "You're Julia Bennett?" he asked, his voice measured but sharp. "Yes." "Sir," she replied softly, her gaze calm and steady, unflinching under his scrutiny. Richard studied her carefully, noticing the subtle stoop of her shoulders, not from fatigue, but from a long practice of observation. She didn't fidget. She didn't smile unnaturally. She simply was. And that being was enough to make him consider that, maybe, just maybe, this was someone who could navigate the strange currents of his household without disturbing the fragile balance of silence. The interview was brief. Julia spoke clearly, avoiding superfluous words, giving direct answers that somehow carried warmth despite their simplicity. When she mentioned that she had recently lost a child, Richard didn't press. He only nodded, recognizing the combination of grief and strength in her eyes. He had known loss. Perhaps he saw a mirror of his own pain reflected there. Her first day began with meticulous attention. She moved quietly through the house, dusting, organizing, folding linens, each task performed with a calm, deliberate precision. And then, for the first time, she saw Ethan. He sat near the tall window in the corner of the living room, his small hands wrapped around the toy airplane. Julia froze for a fraction of a second, observing him from the doorway. The boy was unnervingly still. He didn't respond to her presence. He didn't react to sounds or the movement of shadows across the floor. And yet, something subtle flickered in his eyes. Something almost imperceptible, like a tiny spark hidden beneath a mask of stillness. Julia didn't approach. She didn't speak. She simply took a seat nearby and allowed herself to notice the faint tremor in his fingers as he held the airplane, the slight tilt of his head toward a distant sound. the way he seemed to measure the space around him in silence. Over the next few days, Julia began to observe patterns that others had missed. Ethan reacted, not always to noise, but sometimes to air currents, subtle shifts in light, or movements just outside his peripheral awareness. He was being read like a book, yet no one had noticed the pages turning. Julia started small experiments, dropping a cloth near him, nudging a soft toy gently, moving her shadow across the room. Each time there was a response, subtle but undeniable. A tilt of the head, a twitch of a finger, a shift in posture. It was enough to make her question everything she had been told about him. Had he really been completely blind, or had someone somewhere missed the truth? Richard, meanwhile, noticed the change. He watched Julia interact with his son, noticing subtle smiles, soft hums, and the faintest recognition in Ethan's movements. It was unlike anything he had seen before. For the first time in years, a glimmer of hope stirred within him. That evening, Julia paused near the window where Ethan sat, holding the toy airplane. She noticed a faint reflection of sunlight dancing across the floor. He tilted his head, following it with a precision that stunned her. Her heart raced. This wasn't mere hearing. This was awareness. This was seeing in some form that no one had believed possible. "Richard," she whispered later when they were alone. "There's more to him than we've been told." I think he might be able to see, even if just a little." Richard stared at her, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "That's impossible," he said softly. But the truth of what he had just seen, and what he had failed to see for 7 long years, stung more sharply than he could admit. Julia didn't push. She didn't insist. She simply nodded, letting him process the impossible, knowing that the next steps would require patience, courage, and relentless observation. Later that night, as the mansion settled into its usual quiet, Ethan hummed a tune softly to himself. The toy airplane still clutched in his small hands, and somewhere deep inside the house, Julia watched from the hallway, knowing that something monumental had just begun. It was subtle, almost invisible. But for the first time in years, the walls of the mansion seemed less suffocating. The boy who was supposed to live in darkness might yet glimpse the light. And in that fragile, fleeting moment, the stage was set for discovery, for confrontation, and for the secrets that had remained buried since the day Ethan was born. The quiet click of a door signaled the end of the evening. But the story had only begun. Julia made a mental note. Tomorrow she would try another small test. Another gentle nudge toward light, color, and recognition. And with that, the mansion exhaled, carrying the faintest hint of hope along its empty halls. Ethan's eyes followed the shadow of Julia's hand across the floor. It was a fraction of a second, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And that tiny movement would lead Julia to uncover a truth that no one in the Wakefield estate had ever imagined. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the Wakefield estate in warm, golden streams. The mansion felt alive in a way it hadn't for years. Richard watched from the staircase as Julia moved gracefully through the halls, her presence almost imperceptible, yet undeniably magnetic. Today, she had decided, would be different. She would observe Ethan with a careful purpose, testing boundaries no one had dared to cross. Ethan sat in his usual spot near the window, clutching the toy airplane. The room was quiet, except for the distant hum of the city beyond the estate gates. Julia approached slowly, deliberately, her steps measured so as not to startle him. She placed a soft, patterned scarf on the floor a few feet away, careful to let the sunlight highlight its texture. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice calm but inviting. "Can you feel something different?" He didn't respond at first. He only shifted slightly, tilting his head toward the scarf, then back toward the window. But Julia noticed the subtle twitch of his fingers. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but enough. She bent closer, letting her shadow fall across the scarf, and watched. The twitch came again. This time more deliberate. Ethan's fingers traced the air, following the pattern of sunlight on the floor, as though the light itself guided him. Julia's heart skipped a beat. This was no accident. No random reflex. Ethan was reacting to something he shouldn't have been able to see. Over the next few days, Julia tested him with increasingly precise experiments. A small ball rolled across the marble floor. A feather floated in the air. She changed the position of objects subtly, observing every twitch, every tilt of his head, every fractional adjustment of his posture. Each time he reacted. Each time he surprised her and terrified her. Because the implication was clear, Ethan was not blind. Julia decided it was time to investigate further. She began quietly reviewing medical records and reports, hoping for a clue. That's when she stumbled across something strange. A folder marked, "The doctor's notes were clinical," filled with terms she barely understood. But one line jumped out. No measurable response to light or color. Diagnosis confirmed as congenital blindness. Prognosis, unlikely to improve. And beneath it, scribbled in almost illegible handwriting, was a note from a nurse. Parents insist he shows no reaction. Observation limited to daytime hours. Julia's stomach sank. It was as if the entire diagnosis had been taken at face value, without thorough testing. A child's subtle responses overlooked, ignored, or, worse, dismissed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft cough. Richard had entered the room quietly, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What have you found?" he asked, stepping closer. Julia hesitated. "Sir, I think Ethan might not be completely blind. I need to test him further, carefully. I can't explain it, but his reactions, they're real. He sees something." Richard's eyes widened. "That's impossible," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. Yet the memory of the faint movements he'd seen the previous day lingered in his mind. Could it be true? Could all these years of certainty have been wrong? Julia nodded. "I'll handle it delicately. I promise. No sudden movements, no pressure. Just observation." Richard hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful. I don't want to damage him, physically or emotionally." That afternoon, Julia set up a series of subtle challenges. She moved objects slowly across the floor, arranged mirrors to reflect sunlight in gentle patterns, and even placed a small toy bird on the windowsill. She noted every reaction. The slightest blink, the faintest turn of the head, the almost imperceptible reach of his hand. Each tiny movement confirmed her suspicion. Ethan was not blind, but it wasn't until the evening that the first shock occurred. Julia had placed a small, colorful cube on the floor, just within reach of his hand. She moved her own shadow across it, letting the sunlight highlight its edges. Ethan reached out, not randomly, but deliberately, grasping the cube and holding it up. His eyes followed her hand. Real, focused, searching. Julia gasped softly. "Ethan, you can see." Richard, who had been observing from the doorway, felt his knees weaken. 7 years, 7 long years of believing one thing, only to realize the truth had been hidden behind layers of assumption, fear, and neglect. The next day, Julia approached the subject carefully, speaking to Ethan as though unveiling a secret. She held a small mirror, letting the sunlight dance across its surface, and watched his reaction. He tilted his head, following the light with astonishing precision. Then, in a moment that froze Julia's heart, he smiled. A real smile, bright and unguarded, one that lit up his face and reached into her chest like a jolt of electricity. Richard had never seen it. Not once. Not in all these years. And the magnitude of it hit him like a tidal wave. But the joy was fleeting. Julia's investigation had unearthed another layer of deception. Hidden in the folders was correspondence between the family doctor and a specialist. Their notes hinted at a decision to withhold the truth about Ethan's vision, citing emotional protection for the parents and stability of the household as justification. The realization was devastating. Not only had Ethan been misdiagnosed, but adults in the room had chosen comfort over truth, convenience over discovery. Julia felt a surge of anger, tempered by resolve. Someone had to fix this, carefully and strategically. Over the next week, Julia continued her tests, documenting every small movement. Ethan's awareness grew, his interactions becoming more deliberate. He began to reach for objects he wanted, follow moving shadows, and even recognize voices with precision. The mansion, once a silent fortress, slowly began to hum with life. Yet danger loomed. Julia realized that if the wrong people discovered Ethan's growing awareness, chaos could ensue. Family members who valued appearances over truth might react unpredictably. Doctors who had been complicit in the deception might attempt to suppress the evidence. One evening, as she sat beside Ethan, gently guiding his hands over a new toy airplane, she whispered softly, "We'll uncover the truth, together. But you must trust me." Ethan's fingers tightened around hers, a gesture more powerful than words. Julia felt a surge of determination. Whatever it took, she would reveal the secrets buried in the mansion. She would prove that the boy thought. Blind was, in fact, capable of seeing, and perhaps more than anyone imagined. Julia's careful testing would soon reveal a shocking secret about the doctor who had misdiagnosed Ethan. But uncovering it would put them both at risk, and force Richard to confront uncomfortable truths about his own past. The sun had barely risen over the Wakefield estate when Julia moved through the mansion with purpose. Every corner of the sprawling home seemed to whisper secrets, and after the revelations of the past week, Julia felt a growing urgency. Ethan was no longer a silent observer of the world. He had begun to interact, his awareness sharpening daily. Yet the mansion, with its grandeur and shadows, still held unseen eyes that could turn threat into tragedy if they discovered the boy's awakening too soon. Julia entered Ethan's room quietly, a stack of small, brightly colored blocks in her hands. She laid them on the floor in a deliberate pattern, sunlight streaming through the windows to illuminate each block's edges. Ethan sat cross-legged, hands resting lightly on his knees. His gaze, though hesitant, followed her movements. "Today," Julia said softly, "we're going to play a new game." The words were simple, but there was an undercurrent of challenge in her tone. She picked up a block and moved it across the sunlight, letting the colors reflect on the floor. Ethan's fingers twitched almost imperceptibly, following the motion. Julia's pulse quickened. He was ready. "Can you find it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward, reaching out slowly, deliberately, and grasped the block. The precision of his movements stunned Julia. 7 years of assumed blindness, and yet here was proof of his extraordinary perception. But the moment of triumph was shattered by a sudden, sharp knock on the door. Julia froze, heart racing. "Julia!" Richard's voice called from the hallway, tense and cautious. "May I come in?" She swallowed hard and nodded, gesturing for him to enter. Richard's face was grave, a mixture of worry and disbelief etched across his features. "Ethan," he said softly, stepping closer, "can you show me what you're doing?" Ethan's small hands held the block aloft, and for the first time, Richard saw the undeniable truth. His son's eyes followed the sunlight, tracking the object with unerring accuracy. Richard staggered back, shock written across his face. "Impossible," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Julia approached him slowly. "Sir, we need to talk. There's more you need to understand. Ethan's not blind, and he hasn't been. Someone, maybe even multiple people, decided to hide the truth from you. From everyone." Richard's face paled. Memories of doctors' visits, whispered reassurances, and years of normal treatments flooded his mind. Could it all have been a lie? A mistake? His hand trembled as he reached for the chair, needing something solid to steady himself. I don't understand," he stammered. "Why? Why would they do this?" Julia shook her head, her expression hardening. "Because appearances mattered more than truth. convenience mattered more than discovery. And someone thought they knew better than your son. The gravity of her words hung heavy in the room. Ethan, sensing the tension, clutched the block a little tighter, his small body rigid but alert. Over the next hour, Julia and Richard pieced together fragments of the past, misdiagnoses, subtle deceptions, and the deliberate omission of critical tests. Each revelation chipped away at Richard's composed exterior. By the time they finished, he was a man confronting not only the lies around his child, but also his own negligence, his unquestioning trust in professionals who had failed. Yet the external world was closing in. Julia had been careful in her tests, but one of the estate staff, a sharp-eyed housekeeper named Madeline, had noticed subtle changes in Ethan's behavior. She observed him reaching for objects, following light, and even smiling at things no one had dared to show him before. Madeline was loyal to the household, but wary of Julia, who she viewed as an intruder. Later that afternoon, Julia overheard Madeline whispering to another staff member. "You've noticed it too, right?" Madeline's voice trembled. He can see. "Don't tell Mr. Wakefield. Please, not yet." Julia's stomach twisted. They were not alone in the shadows. Every discovery she made now carried risk, not just to her, but to Ethan. Determined to protect him, Julia crafted a careful strategy. She would continue testing Ethan, pushing his boundaries gently, all while remaining invisible to those who might expose them. She introduced more complex challenges, a small maze of blocks, mirrors reflecting sunlight, and subtle auditory cues to see how he responded. Ethan's reactions were astonishing. He navigated the obstacles with precision, his confidence growing with every success. But the mansion had its own threats. A letter arrived that evening, unsigned but unmistakably pointed. Some truths are better left hidden. Stop your games, or there will be consequences. Julia's eyes narrowed. Someone knew. Someone was watching, perhaps from within the very walls of the estate. Her mind raced. Who could it be? A staff member? A doctor still involved in Ethan's care? Or worse, someone with motives Richard and she could not yet fathom. As darkness fell over the mansion, Julia sat beside Ethan, letting him explore a small wooden puzzle. She whispered softly, "We're not alone, Ethan. There are people who want to keep secrets, but we're stronger than they think. We'll reveal the truth. Together." Ethan looked up, his eyes bright with trust and curiosity. Julia's heart ached with a mixture of fear and hope. She knew the next steps would be dangerous. Exposing the hidden observer would require courage, strategy, and careful manipulation of every ally and potential enemy within the estate. The night deepened, shadows stretching across the grand halls. Julia and Ethan huddled close, a silent promise between them. Whatever came, they would face it together. And soon, the first true confrontation with those guarding the secrets of Ethan's life would arrive. A confrontation that could shatter the delicate balance of trust, power, and deception in the Wakefield mansion. The hidden observer will make their first overt move, forcing Julia to take drastic measures. Ethan's growing abilities will attract attention, and Richard must finally confront the uncomfortable truth about his own past choices. The stakes escalate from hidden tests to an imminent, high-stakes revelation. The following morning, the Wakefield mansion was cloaked in an uneasy quiet. The sun rose in golden slivers, catching dust motes in its beams, yet the warmth could not dispel the tension that gripped Julia. Last night's letter had rattled her. Someone knew Ethan could see, and that someone was calculating, precise, and dangerous. Julia moved carefully through the halls, her senses alert. Every footstep, every distant creak of wood, was a signal she monitored with increasing paranoia. Ethan, sensing her tension, stayed close, his small hand finding hers like a lifeline. "Julia, why are you so nervous?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. She knelt beside him, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "There are people who want to keep secrets hidden, Ethan, but secrets like ours, they're powerful, and powerful secrets always attract attention." Ethan's small brow furrowed. He didn't fully understand yet, but he felt the weight of her words. By mid-morning, the first evidence of the hidden observer emerged. A vase had been moved overnight, not drastically, just slightly off-center on a hallway table, but enough for Julia to notice. Her pulse quickened. Whoever it was had entered while she and Ethan slept, confirming that the threat was close, intimate, and aware of their every move. Julia immediately devised a subtle test. She left a small, intricate puzzle on the table, its pieces arranged in a pattern known only to her and Ethan. If it were disturbed overnight, she would know someone had been inside the room. By afternoon, the puzzle was disrupted. Pieces scattered, some moved out of alignment. Julia's mind raced. The observer was no longer a passive threat. They were proactive, testing boundaries, daring Julia to respond. Determined to protect Ethan, Julia began mapping patterns. She observed staff movements, noting who lingered in hallways, whose eyes darted suspiciously, and who avoided her gaze. Madeline, the sharp-eyed housekeeper, had become the primary suspect. She moved with purpose, and every glance seemed loaded with secret knowledge. Yet Julia knew better than to act hastily. Accusation without evidence could backfire disastrously. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to excel in the tests Julia crafted. She had introduced mirrors to reflect sunlight across the room, small auditory cues to guide him, and a series of increasingly complex block arrangements. With each success, his confidence grew, but his growing abilities also drew attention. Late in the afternoon, Richard approached Julia. His face was pale, haunted by the revelations of the previous day. "Julia, we can't hide him forever," he said, voice low and urgent. "If someone has been watching, we need to confront them." "Now," Julia shook her head. "We don't know who it is, sir, and rushing in could make things worse. We need strategy, observation, and preparation. One misstep and they could hurt Ethan, or worse, remove him from this house entirely." Richard's hands clenched into fists. He had spent a lifetime controlling his environment, but now he felt powerless, blind to the true forces moving within his own home. By evening, the observer made their first overt move. A note, this time left where Julia would see it, not hidden among shadows. "You play a dangerous game. Stop or consequences will fall." Julia's blood ran cold. Whoever it was, they were bold, confident, and increasingly impatient. She realized that subtle observation was no longer enough. Ethan's abilities were no longer a secret, and every day they delayed action, the risk multiplied. That night, Julia devised a plan. She would lure the observer into revealing themselves. Carefully, she left a trail of objects, a string of blocks, small mirrors reflecting sunlight, even a few toys that Ethan had mastered, all placed in deliberate patterns designed to attract attention. The plan was dangerous. The observer might suspect the trap or worse, retaliate. But Julia knew that the longer she waited, the more vulnerable Ethan became. Meanwhile, Ethan, sensing her tension, grew restless. He wanted to explore, to interact, to test his abilities more openly. Julia had to restrain him gently, explaining the need for caution. "Patience," she whispered. "Sometimes we must wait to strike, even when our hearts want action." By midnight, the trap was set. Julia hid in the shadows, Ethan asleep in his bed, and every sense alert to the slightest disturbance. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the windows, sent Julia's heart racing. Finally, the observer revealed themselves. A shadow slipped through the hallway, careful but deliberate. Julia recognized Madeline immediately, the sharp-eyed housekeeper who had watched Ethan so closely. But this time she was not alone. Another figure followed, cloaked in darkness, face obscured. Julia's mind raced. Who was the accomplice? A staff member? A hired hand? Someone with ties to the doctors who had hidden the truth? As the figures approached the puzzle trail, Julia stepped forward. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the silence like a whip. Madeline froze, eyes wide with recognition and fear. The second figure remained shadowed, but tension crackled in the air like static. "You don't understand," Madeline stammered. We're just trying to protect him." "You don't know what you're dealing with." Julia's eyes narrowed. "Protect him? From what? From truth?" From his own life? Madeline faltered, unsure whether to flee or reveal more. Julia advanced cautiously, noting every micro-expression, every hesitation. Then, the second figure stepped forward. A man in his 40s, sharply dressed, exuding authority and menace. Julia's heart sank. He was not a staff member. He was someone with influence, someone who had orchestrated years of deception with calculated precision. "I told you to stop," the man said, voice cold and unyielding. "This child is not ready, and neither are you." Julia realized the danger instantly. This was bigger than she had imagined. It wasn't just staff members trying to hide the truth. It was a carefully constructed network of people with power, intent on controlling Ethan's life. The confrontation escalated quickly. Julia positioned herself between Ethan and the intruders, adrenaline surging. Every instinct screamed for her to protect him at all costs. Richard, drawn by the commotion, arrived just in time to witness the standoff. His eyes widened in shock, not just at the intruders, but at the reality he had ignored for years. "You're trying to control my son?" he demanded, voice shaking with anger and disbelief. The man's gaze hardened. "Your son is not a possession, Mr. Wakefield. He is an asset, something far more valuable than you realize. And we are the only ones who can ensure he reaches his potential." Julia felt a surge of fury. "Potential? You've been lying, manipulating, and hiding him all his life. And now you think you can dictate his future?" The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Ethan, sensing the heightened emotions, stirred in his sleep, his small hands clutching the blanket. Julia knew the next few moments would define everything. This was the first real test. Not just of her courage, but of her strategy, wits, and ability to protect Ethan from those who sought to exploit him. A dramatic showdown will unfold, forcing hidden truths into the open. Julia must outsmart the intruders, protect Ethan, and begin the reversal that will shift the power dynamic entirely. Stakes escalate as Richard confronts the consequences of his past trust, and the network controlling Ethan is fully revealed. The tension in the Wakefield mansion had reached a fever pitch. Julia's heart pounded as she stood between Ethan and the intruders, her mind racing through every contingency, every defensive tactic she had ever devised. This was no longer a test of patience or observation. It was a battle for control, for the truth, and for Ethan's future. Richard's voice cut through the charged silence. "Who are you, and what have you done to my son?" The man in the shadows, sharply dressed, stepped closer. His gaze was cold, precise, and unyielding. "Mr. Wakefield, your son's life has been orchestrated from the moment he was born. We have ensured his abilities develop under careful supervision, hidden from the world to protect and to control." Julia felt her stomach knot. She had suspected layers of deception, but this revelation surpassed even her darkest imaginings. Ethan's blindness, or what everyone believed to be blindness, was part of a meticulously crafted plan, a manipulation extending far beyond the mansion walls. Madeline, the housekeeper, shifted uneasily. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she admitted, voice trembling. We thought we were helping him, guiding him safely. But it got out of control." Julia's eyes blazed with anger and determination. "Helping? You've lied to everyone. You've stolen years of his life, deceived his parents, and treated him like an experiment." Ethan, sensing the heightened emotions, stirred awake. His small eyes blinked against the dim light, and Julia gently took his hand. "It's okay, Ethan. You're safe now. I promise." The man in the suit ignored her words. "He is not ready. He cannot be allowed to see the world's dangers, not yet. His mind, his abilities, they are beyond what you comprehend." Richard stepped forward, voice shaking but resolute. "Enough. You've controlled my son long enough. He is not your asset, your experiment, or your secret weapon. He's my child, and I will not let you manipulate him any longer." Julia realized this was the pivotal moment. The intruder's confidence, their calm authority, had always relied on fear and secrecy. By confronting them openly, she could force the first cracks in their carefully maintained facade. With a deep breath, she revealed the puzzle trail she had set the previous night. "You see this?" she said. You thought you could move silently, manipulate, and intimidate. But we've been watching, anticipating every step you would take. You're not in control here anymore. The man's eyes flicked to the scattered puzzle pieces, his expression momentarily unreadable. Madeline's face went pale, guilt and fear etched into every line. Then Ethan, small but resolute, spoke for the first time since waking. You lied. You lied to me. The words, simple yet powerful, struck like lightning. Julia felt a surge of pride and relief. Ethan's awareness and courage were awakening, and the intruders were confronted with something they could not anticipate. His voice, his agency, his refusal to remain passive. The man in the suit clenched his jaw. You do not understand the world you are stepping into. You are unprepared for the consequences of knowledge. Julia stepped closer, unwavering. The only consequence I care about is protecting him. And if that means revealing your lies, exposing your network, and ensuring he chooses his own path, so be it. Madeline, finally breaking, sank to her knees. It's true, she confessed. He was never blind. He could see all along. We just hid it. We were instructed to create the illusion, to ensure he didn't draw attention. I didn't want to, but I had no choice. The room fell into stunned silence. Julia knelt beside Ethan, gently lifting his chin so he could look at her. Ethan, she whispered, the truth is out. You're stronger than anyone ever realized, and now you can finally see everything, literally and figuratively. Ethan's eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and wonder, began to take in the room. Light, shadows, shapes, everything that had been hidden suddenly became clear. His first breaths were shallow, as if he were absorbing a world that had existed beyond his reach for years. Richard, his hands shaking, took Ethan in his arms. My boy, my son, he murmured, overwhelmed with emotion. Tears blurred his vision as he realized the enormity of what had been hidden from them both. The man in the suit, sensing his control slipping, made a desperate move. He lunged toward Ethan, voice sharp and commanding. You do not understand what you are unleashing. He cannot handle the world like this. He must remain. Contained, Julia reacted instantly. With a swift movement, she placed herself between Ethan and the intruder, holding firm. No, you will not touch him. Not now, not ever. Richard stepped beside her, his stature and authority a shield. Leave before I call the authorities. Your time controlling him is over. The tension escalated to a breaking point. For a moment, it seemed the confrontation might turn violent. But then Ethan, small yet determined, spoke again, his voice steady. I see you. All of you. And I choose who I trust. That declaration shattered the intruder's composure. Madeline sobbed openly, realizing that the deception she had maintained was collapsing. The man in the suit, now stripped of the illusion of control, glared but had no recourse. Finally, he and his accomplices withdrew, their threats hollow in the face of truth and courage. Julia and Richard watched them leave, every muscle in their bodies taut from the confrontation. The room, once heavy with fear, began to breathe again. Ethan, still processing the revelations, looked at Julia. I can see everything. Julia knelt beside him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. Yes, Ethan. And from now on, you'll choose how to use that sight. You're free to explore, to learn, to grow, without anyone manipulating you. Richard, tears streaking his face, embraced Julia and Ethan in a protective circle. We'll face the world together, he vowed. No secrets, no control, just the truth. As the sun rose higher, filling the room with light, Julia realized that this was the first true turning point. The intruders had been exposed, Ethan's abilities were no longer hidden, and the dynamic had shifted entirely. For the first time, they had the upper hand, not through manipulation, not through secrecy, but through courage, strategy, an unwavering dedication to the child they loved. While immediate threats have been neutralized, a new layer of danger emerges as external forces, those benefiting from Ethan's hidden life, begin to take notice. The stakes escalate from internal deception to global exposure, and Julia must prepare for challenges far greater than any she has faced before. The morning after the confrontation, the Wakefield mansion felt both familiar and irrevocably altered. Light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the luxurious interiors, yet a shadow lingered in every corner, an invisible weight left by the previous night's revelations. Julia sat in the grand study, Ethan beside her, his small hands tracing the surface of the polished oak desk. Every detail he could finally see amazed him. The grains of the wood, the intricate patterns of the carvings, even the glint of sunlight on the antique inkwell. It's incredible, Ethan whispered, awe lacing his tone. His voice no longer carried the passive uncertainty of a child sheltered by lies. It carried the weight of someone stepping into his own agency for the first time. Julia smiled softly. It is incredible. And it's yours to explore now. No one can hide it from you anymore. Richard entered, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. Julia, Ethan, we can't linger here too long. Last night's events were just the beginning. Those people, whoever they really were, they don't vanish quietly. There's a network, and now they know their control is gone. Julia nodded, feeling the familiar knot of tension tighten in her stomach. The revelation of Ethan's sight had not only dismantled the intruder's immediate control, but had also signaled to anyone with vested interest that the child was no longer there, upon before they could process the implications fully. A sharp knock echoed through the study. Julia's hand instinctively moved to the drawer, where she kept her phone and a small emergency device. Richard's voice was calm but wary. Who is it? A messenger appeared in the doorway, uniformed and carrying a sealed envelope. The man's eyes avoided meeting theirs, and his posture was stiff, almost fearful. He handed the envelope to Richard, muttering, "This came from the agency. They insist it be delivered personally." Richard broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The elegant handwriting immediately conveyed authority, but the words within sent a chill down his spine. The child has been exposed. Immediate extraction is recommended. Do not underestimate the reach of those who benefited from his concealment. Every move must be calculated. You are now in their crosshairs. Julia read over his shoulder, her mind racing. This was no longer just about the intruders in the mansion. Someone, somewhere, had been orchestrating a global network that profited from Ethan's hidden life. And now, with the truth revealed, their attention had shifted squarely onto him. Ethan, sensing the tension, asked softly, "What does it mean?" Julia knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "It means we're not safe. Not just here, not just in the mansion. There are people who want to control you, and they'll stop at nothing." Richard's jaw tightened. "We need to move, immediately. Pack essentials. Leave the estate before they make their move." The next hours were a whirlwind of preparation. Julia coordinated with trusted allies, gathering resources, emergency contacts, and surveillance equipment. Ethan's abilities, now fully awakened, proved unexpectedly useful. He could see patterns and details that adults often overlooked, spotting potential threats in shadows, subtle movements and unexpected angles. As night fell, the Wakefields executed a stealthy departure from the mansion. Their convoy wound through winding roads, far from main highways, relying on a network of secure safe houses Richard had maintained for emergencies. Each turn, each stop, brought new awareness of how far-reaching the network against Ethan had been. Surveillance cameras, unknown to them until now, had dotted the mansion grounds. Strange vehicles had been seen lurking near the estate. In the quiet of the car, Ethan leaned against Julia, whispering, "I feel like I'm seeing the world for the first time." Julia's heart swelled with pride and worry. "Yes, you are. And it's a dangerous world, Ethan, but together we can navigate it. We'll find who's behind this, and we'll ensure they never hurt you or anyone else again." The first safe house, an old countryside estate shielded by thick woods, provided temporary respite. Julia and Richard began poring over documents and digital traces left by the intruders, piecing together the network's structure. Each discovery revealed more unsettling truths. International connections, powerful financiers, and shadow organizations that had profited from keeping Ethan's abilities hidden. Ethan, now fully aware of his sight and perceptiveness, became an active participant in the strategy. He noticed anomalies in documents, inconsistencies in timelines, and subtle clues that adults had overlooked. Julia marveled at how quickly he adapted. His intelligence sharpened not only by years of observation, but by a newfound urgency to reclaim his autonomy. As they worked late into the night, a soft knock startled them. Julia and Richard, already on edge, reached for defensive tools. But it was just Madeline, her eyes filled with remorse and determination. "I can help," she said quietly. "I know the network. I know how they operate. I can guide you through their strategies. If you trust me." Julia exchanged a wary glance with Richard. Trust had been a fragile commodity since the revelations, but Madeline's insider knowledge could be invaluable. "We'll need your guidance," Julia admitted cautiously. "But any misstep could cost us everything." The following days became a tense dance of strategy, reconnaissance, and constant vigilance. Ethan's world, once small and carefully controlled, expanded rapidly. Every corner of the countryside, every shadow in the woods, every whisper of movement became a potential clue or threat. Julia and Richard worked tirelessly to balance his education, protection and empowerment. Then one evening, as Ethan practiced identifying subtle patterns in the forest surrounding the safe house, he froze. His gaze fixed on a seemingly empty clearing where the rustling of leaves suggested movement. "They're here," he whispered, voice barely audible but filled with certainty. Julia and Richard tensed. Through Ethan's newfound perception, they saw figures, 2 men, cloaked in dark gear, surveying the estate from a distance. Their postures were professional, calculated, like trained operatives. Julia drew a deep breath. This is no longer about hiding. We confront, we protect, and we fight back on our terms. Richard nodded, resolve hardening. Tonight, we take the first step toward reclaiming Ethan's life and dismantling the network that tried to control it. Ethan's small hand gripped Julia's. "I'm ready." As night deepened, the forest became both shield and stage for the unfolding confrontation. Shadows lengthened, whispers of strategy passed between the trio, and the distant figures moved closer, unaware that the child they had sought to manipulate was now fully awake, fully aware, and fully prepared to see through their every move. This was the moment when the game truly escalated, the transition from defensive survival to calculated offense. The stakes had risen from personal deception to global danger, and the Wakefields, guided by courage, intelligence, and unbreakable family bonds, would have to outwit an enemy far more sophisticated than any they had faced before. The operatives close in, and Ethan must use his fully awakened abilities to uncover their plan before it's too late. Julia and Richard must act decisively, balancing risk and strategy, while the network's influence begins to ripple outward, endangering allies, safe houses, and the very world they thought secure. The forest surrounding the countryside estate seemed calm under the pale moonlight, but the air was thick with tension. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow stretching across the clearing, held potential danger. Julia, Richard, and Ethan moved with deliberate caution, hearts pounding in unison. For the first time, Ethan was no longer a passive observer. He was a key part of the strategy. "They're close," Ethan whispered, eyes scanning the tree line. His newly awakened sight picked up subtle signs adults often missed. The slight glint of moonlight on tactical gear, the faint disturbance of soil where someone had stepped, and the rhythmic breathing of the intruders hidden among the trees. Richard clenched his fists. "We need a plan. This isn't just an ambush. They're trained, coordinated. One misstep." He let the sentence hang, the danger implicit. Julia knelt beside Ethan. "You've got this. I'll be with you every step. Remember, what you see is power. Use it." The first movement came from the shadows, a pair of figures moving silently toward the estate, unaware they had been detected. Julia signaled Richard, and they all ducked behind a thick line of bushes. Ethan's sharp gaze followed the intruders' paths, noting subtle cues that revealed their intentions. One was scouting, while the other carried equipment for forced entry. "They're planning to cut power first," Ethan said, voice calm but urgent. "Then they'll come at us from the west side." Richard's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" Ethan pointed to disturbed leaves forming a faint line toward the generator shed. "It's subtle, but I can see it." "They're trying to isolate the estate before moving in," Julia nodded, adrenaline surging. "Good. That means we can set a trap." The next hour became a tense chess match. Julia and Richard moved quietly through the trees, setting discrete obstacles and alert systems, while Ethan provided guidance, predicting the intruders' paths with unnerving accuracy. Rocks were placed strategically to create noise if tripped. A series of motion sensors and lights were prepared to disorient the attackers. Then the first strike came. A low hum of machinery. The intruders had reached the generator shed and began tampering. Ethan's eyes widened. "They're faster than I thought," Julia whispered. "Stick to the plan." "Don't panic." Richard crept closer and with a quick motion disabled the tampering device with his tools, sending a jolt of electricity back into the shed. Sparks flew. The sudden light exposed one intruder, who froze, realizing they had been detected. Ethan acted instinctively, pointing toward a small camouflaged path. "Left! He'll try to circle around." Julia nodded, signaling Richard. They split, guiding the intruders toward the obstacles they had laid out. Rocks tumbled, sensors triggered flashing lights, and the element of surprise turned the tide. The intruders, though skilled, were now reacting to Ethan's foresight and the Wakefield's planning. One intruder lunged toward Julia, attempting to incapacitate her, but Ethan anticipated the movement, stepping forward to trip the attacker with a calculated sweep of his leg. The man fell hard, stunned by the unexpected resistance from the child. Julia rushed to subdue him while Richard secured the perimeter. "Good job, Ethan," Julia whispered, keeping her voice low so the remaining intruders wouldn't hear. Ethan's chest heaved. "We're not done. The other one. He's inside the compound." Sure enough, the second intruder had slipped past the obstacles and reached the house, attempting to gain entry. Julia realized the danger. If he reached the inner estate, the safe house would be compromised. "Madeline," Julia hissed into the small radio. "He's inside." "Intercept now!" Moments later, a quiet but determined figure emerged from the shadows. Madeline. Using stealth and knowledge of the estate's layout, she cornered the intruder near the east wing. With a combination of precision and cunning, she immobilized him, ensuring no alarms were triggered inside the safe house. Julia and Richard regrouped, assessing the situation. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the attack was just the beginning. The network behind these operatives was powerful, relentless, and now fully aware of Ethan's abilities. Ethan's eyes, wide and alert, scanned the aftermath. "They won't stop. They'll send more. Bigger teams, faster, smarter." Julia placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we have to be ready. This was just a test, the first strike. We survived because we anticipated it and because you saw what no one else could." Richard nodded grimly. "We need to escalate. Defensive tactics aren't enough anymore. We have to find them before they find us." For the rest of the night, the Wakefields fortified the estate, implementing new security measures and strategies, preparing for inevitable attacks. Ethan studied maps, observing potential vulnerabilities, while Julia and Richard worked to contact allies who could assist in identifying the global network. As dawn approached, the exhausted trio gathered in the study, a mixture of relief and tension lingering in the air. They had survived the first strike, but the danger was far from over. Ethan, staring at the rising sun, whispered, "I don't want to hide anymore." "I want to fight." Julia's eyes softened, yet determination hardened her gaze. "And we will, together." Richard's voice was steady, resolute. "Tonight was only the beginning. The network thinks they can control him, but they're wrong. From now on, we take the fight to them. The Wakefields prepare to launch a counter-offensive against the network, using Ethan's abilities to infiltrate their operations. Meanwhile, the intruders regroup and report back to their leaders, setting the stage for a confrontation that will escalate the conflict from local attacks to a full-scale, high-stakes battle. Ethan, once thought powerless and blind to the truth of his own fate, finally uncovers the full conspiracy that kept him in darkness, both literally and metaphorically. The corrupt doctors, the scheming relatives, and the shadowy business rivals who profited from his misfortune are exposed one by one, as Julia's meticulous investigation and Ethan's newfound courage bring the truth to light. In a tense courtroom scene, the mastermind behind the deception is publicly confronted. Witnesses testify, documents are revealed, and every lie is unraveled. Ethan's family and the staff who once doubted him watch in awe as the final pieces fall into place. Julia stands silently by his side, her quiet strength the anchor that helped him believe in himself.